I'm very happy to welcome Patrick Richards, our next speaker. Patrick is a very, very well-connected and experienced travel leader. He looks back at a long and impressive career in leading positions in the industry in the UK and internationally. Today, Patrick focuses mainly on non-executive board work. Among other, he is a board member at ETOA, that's the German pronunciation, I guess you Brits call it ETOA, and Nordic Collective. For me, perhaps even more importantly, Patrick is an extremely helpful person, and he has been very helpful and cooperative in setting up a couple of our events on this platform. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. Patrick has invited a very special guest, but I will leave the introduction to Patrick. So Patrick, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Jan, and good day to everybody from a very wet and rainy London. Yeah, firstly, thanks to Jan and the Buzz team for giving me this opportunity. This session is titled Silver Linings and How Collaboration and Technology Can Get Us Back on Our Feet. As Jan said, my name's Patrick Richards, and I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour around a few positives and also dangers that we might take from this current moment. I'll speak for about 25 minutes, and then I'll bring in my colleague, my esteemed colleague over here, Mr. Ashish Kumar, who is a fulcrum at the center of the Indian tourism industry. And we'll shoot the breeze a little bit on a fireside chat when we'll go into a little more depth on some of these issues. So silver linings. First, you need a cloud, yeah. And what a stormy cumulonimbus it's been. We're a 1.8 trillion industry that ground to a halt in March time. 26,000 redundancies from Lufthansa is probably only the start of it. With the OECD expecting double-digit unemployment very shortly. And certainly when government furloughs come to an end, I think we're going to transition from the first phase medical emergency of all of this into a deeper economic crisis, which could be long-lasting. But storm clouds are part of the human experience. I remember in 9/11, I was in Madrid, or just after 9/11, I was in Madrid, and my wife had just given birth to our first daughter. And, you know, all sorts of dark thoughts were running through my mind as to, you know, have I done the right thing, bringing her into this world? Our plane's going to come crashing out of the sky into our hospital in Madrid. Fortunately enough, none of these were founded. And actually, I think it's a great story that there's always light at the end of a tunnel. We will recover from, we did recover from 9/11, and we will recover from COVID. Today, that little baby is an 18-year-old young woman who I'm very proud of. So, travel, it's worth fighting for. But I'm going to quote Don Maquis, who said, yes, there are silver linings, but sometimes it's difficult to get them to the mint. Yeah? And what I interpret him to mean from that is, look, we've got to fight for what we need. And I'm going to come up with a few points as to how we can do that. And really, that's going to cover three separate areas. One will be that we need enhanced industry collaboration to get where we want to get to. Secondly, that there is a unstoppable momentum now for sustainability. And thirdly, will be that the renewed adoption of technology will be critical in getting us to economic viability. So, good times probably lead to bad habits. The tourism industry has had a roller coaster over the last 50 years. 170 million people traveling in 1970, up to 1.4 billion in 2019. Yeah, so with money rolling in, there's no real incentive to change bad behaviors. But now it's a necessity. We have to be able to change, and we have to be able to innovate. We really have no choice. So pressing the reset button and innovating will be critical for us. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about collaboration. That's my first silver lining. And the first point, I'm going to cover 6 sub-points. The first point being, we need as an industry to lobby more effectively. Our industry right now is 10.3%, or was until recently, 10.3% of global GDP, and created 1 in 7 new jobs worldwide. This should not be viewed as the fun industry, you know, and we should not be talking to junior ministers with junior portfolios. We need to up our game in lobbying and talking to government. Very, very soon, governments will be allocating major cash in rebooting this industry. And we as tourists and the tourism industry need to make sure that we are punching above our weight and making a compelling story with a coherent collective voice in order to get our fair share of that of those funds. So no longer can be the case, as governments used to joke, that you talk to 10 different tourist people and you get 11 opinions. So I know that there's been some great work done. I want to single out the work of ASTA, which I think has been outstanding in making sure that travel advisors were included in the recent CARES Relief Act in the United States. But we need to be able to go further. And I think this means getting behind our best trade associations and making sure that they have the muscle to be able to go to governments and represent us. A second point is that locals need to take back initiatives, and they're going to be taking back the initiative to control their own communities. Think of Venice, you know, which potentially is a city that's one of the world's assets and could go into a spiral of decline. Think global, act local was actually a phrase designed in the 1970s, but I think it's extremely relevant to today. ITOA, who, you know, I'm a non-executive director, have done a great job in acting as a catalyst at city level. And what they've really done is be able to bring together diverse interest groups to be able to put cities on the agenda. They've also done 2 critical things, which is to bring linkages from the cities back to decision makers in Brussels, and also from the cities out to the buyers and the tour operators on source markets. This really shows and proves the power of a network, but we've got to be able to kick on. In redesigning tourism, we need to have mechanisms which will be effective across industry for the communication process. And although these need to be inclusive, they also need to be agile, and they also need to be grounded in commercialism. So I think that the DMOs, and I know there are many DMOs out there, have a really good opportunity to be able to lead this charge. But I would contend that the M in DMO is a necessity to change from destination marketing to destination management. And that change cannot be cosmetic. It has to be a real change in the DNA, in upskilling some of the upskilling skills. So the next thing I think is a localized supply lane. It really makes me wonder why in the UK we export 80% of the fish we catch, yet we import 75% of the fish we eat. Surely food should be an intrinsic part of a great tourism product. So eating local products, surely this is a great part. Now, you know, we've seen it on another level. I think France recently realized that they were importing 90% of their pharmaceuticals from China. And Bruno Le Maire, their finance minister, realized that this was untenable. And I would stress that these local supply lines are an important thing in the future. Nevertheless, a couple of concerns. One, as supply tightens, that means that prices increase. And as prices increase, there's a danger that travel becomes the preserve of the wealthy. So this is something that we really need to avoid and keep travel as a democratic process. Secondly, as communities become more local, there can be a risk that there becomes suspicion of outsiders, especially in a global pandemic. And again, travel is a great opener and a great inclusive educator in the world. And this is something that we need to, any unintended consequences is something that we need to avoid at all costs. The next thing I think we need to look at as an industry is the arcane way in which cash flows around our industry. I was recently on a webinar, a consumer-facing webinar run by the Times newspaper in London. And the feedback from consumers was universally condemnatory of the failure of a lot of tourism businesses to repay refunds. Now, as insiders, we know it's more complex and long supply lines. However, I don't think the cash-strapped consumer looks at it in the same way. And we all know of businesses that exist off cash flow where they collect their money from customers months out and pay their suppliers months after departure. This is no longer tenable. Similarly, we know internally that airlines own tour operators and tour operators own DMCs, etc., etc. This is something that's really ripe for review, and I'm hoping actually that travel technology can play a major part in reviewing this. On a related note, I think this means that we need to have at the core of our industry financially sound businesses. Warren Buffett always makes the comment that when the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked. And I think this applies to us. I, for one, was quite stunned to find out at the start of this that airlines only have 2 months of cash in their reserves. So strengthening balance sheets for all of our businesses will be important. It was interesting to see how Expedia have streamlined their business, especially in the last year. And this will make them smaller. Airbnb too, although I think Airbnb are going to struggle with the fact that their cost of capital is 12% interest rates, which seems that's going to hold them back quite a lot. But you can see the contrasting fortunes of businesses when, for example, in the UK budget hotel space, where Premier Inn have paid all their landlords and Travelodge have invoked something called a CVA, which means that they've withheld all their rents. So, although Travelodge undoubtedly will survive as a chain, we can certainly see that there will be others that will go under. And actually, Bernstein, the wealth manager, recently estimated that 7% of the world's hotels will go under this year. So we know that there's a positive side to this too, because every gardener knows that they sometimes have to prune the garden to be able to let young plants grow. As moribund businesses die, new businesses will grow into that space, and that will lead new innovation. Even as far as Expedia go, if they exit certain niches that they find to be unprofitable, there'll be small, hungry young companies wanting to get into that space and make it their own. And that to me is a positive thing. The other area where I think we need to collaborate, and there'll be a benefit from COVID, will be our value of human capital and our people. You know, recently I saw an interesting article which said travel advisors' jobs have changed to journey planners. And I think this recognizes the complexity that travel advisors now have to deal with. Complex border issues, health and safety protocols, complex supplier codes of practice. You know, all of these they have to know. And the fact that a lot of them have incorporated this successfully is proof positive of their value proposition. So, you know, especially if you've been hanging on the end of a call center queue for hours, or trying to negotiate with the chatbot, I think this human interaction is really valued. On top of that, if they have to incorporate technology, destination knowledge globally, and soft skills, I think it can be seen that we need to invest in our people, and quite frequently that can be online training, but definitely the industry needs to upskill itself with its people. Shout out here to Visit Portugal, which recently trained 30,000 of its staff online, or 30,000 of the industry online, which I think is great. The end goal being that, you know, we will achieve better professional recognition within the travel industry and more parity on remuneration against other industries, which I think will stand our industry in good stead. The second real area I want to go into is sustainability. My friends Paul and Andy from the Nordic Tourism Collective recently held a webinar where they asked whether sustainability would be kicked into the long grass as a result of COVID. The panel's answer was no, and I think I agree with them. And I'm going to give some observations as to why. Firstly, this will be driven by consumers. In 2019, Euromonitor ran a survey where they said that 65% of customers would make their travel choices based on a sustainable supplier. Now, if you think that might have died down with COVID, it hasn't. And Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the hotel website, recently ran another survey where they saw that the appetite for sustainable products had gone up from 10% pre-COVID to 60% post-COVID. So that momentum is growing all the time. Secondly, I think we have to look at communities. We've all seen the benefit of birdsong and 1950s levels pollution over the last few months. And to me, that's only going to accelerate the trend where communities take back control of their own living environment. The third area is governments. Most governments have signed up to binding sustainability carbon emissions targets, many of them with hard targets by 2030 and 2050. In fact, for the EU, now sustainability is one of its twin pillars of recovery along with digitization. So, you know, they have to rise to a challenge, and actually hitting those challenges between 2008 and 2013 and 2013 and 2018 in the case of the UK government has been relatively easy. The next set of targets becomes more difficult. For the UK, we have to improve our emissions by 30%. And that means, in my view, that governments can no longer only target the public sector and large corporations. They need to be able to go into the private sector, and they need to legislate with all the carrots and sticks that may involve. So if there's SMEs out there sitting thinking, probably any sustainability legislation won't apply to me, I would politely say that that's wrong, because governments are going to have to get into the SME sector in the future. The next sector which will cause pressure on sustainability is investors. And this will happen for two reasons. One, that there'll be pressure from their own onward investors and governments to conform. And secondly, there are real benefits to profitability. So if you look at hotels, for an example, a hotel, 20%, up to 20% of its operational expense will be energy costs. If you carry out an energy audit, it is generally accepted that you can make savings, again, of up to 20% on those energy costs. And that's without any capital expenditure. Make capital expenditure, and then you can save another 20%. So that investment shows real ROI. Now fold into that benefits that you can subsequently get from grants, from preferential green finance. And this really makes a benefit to shareholders and investors who take this green course. Nevertheless, I do think with sustainability, we need to up our game on transparency. At the moment, there's a bewildering array of measurement systems. I'd say an alphabet soup of measurement systems, of opaque accreditation schemes and sticky plaster carbon offsetting schemes. And I think these really needs to be addressed. You know, how can consumers tell the difference between something that's authentic and a greenwashing exercise? And where we don't want to end up is where people with expensive media advisors are the only ones who can get cut through to the public. A survey by TUI found that only 1 in 10 people bought their hotel room based on a sustainable product. However, if sustainability was more transparent, this would increase to 5 out of 10, which is something quite significant. Actually, we're at ATOA, we're currently running a sustainability survey where we expect to get the results at the end of July. And if you'd like to participate in that, please feel free to reach out. The third and final area I want to go into is technology. In 1990, my old boss, David Babai at GTA, switched his attention to technology because he saw its potential. And then he made 3 predictions, 2 of which were wrong, and 1 of which was spot on. The 2 that were wrong, our staff by 40%. This didn't happen. We actually increased our staff numbers. He said he thought it would take 10 to 12 weeks. Again, 18 years later, he was still immersed in technology. But where crucially he was right, he saw that the scale that this could bring to GTA's business would increase our sales by thousands of %. And actually, the fact that then this came to fruition enabled him and his partners to be able to sell the business in 2005 for $1.1 billion. Unfortunately, I don't think many tourism leaders, especially at an SME level, share this feeling about technology. Often it's expensive, people get locked in. If they want to make fixes, they have to go to the back of a long software, somebody else's long software pipeline. And you know, this leads to a problem with technology that needs to be resolved in much of our industry. And that means that some people don't have operating systems at all. Others get locked into what I would call 30% syndrome. In other words, they've adopted technology that looks after 30% of their needs, but the whole process has been so traumatic that they then give up and with any further rollout and rely on manual workarounds for future enhancements. I really think that that needs to be addressed. Now, if we move on to where in the travel technology sphere this might be, clearly touchless technology is going to have an impact, and it's going to have an impact on the check-ins and checkouts at hotels, etc., etc. But actually here I want to concentrate on another area, and that is these mid and back office systems that sit in the B2B supply chain and interact between different companies. Often there is massive human duplication, checks, manual inputs, etc., especially when companies are working off systems that don't speak to, or for customers going forward. I'll give you a non-travel example which might exemplify this. I recently heard that senior executives at banks receive manual updates to their manuals every week, which make up twice the volume of the complete works of Shakespeare. So there's no way that they can absorb all of this information, and consequently they don't. Now on a travel space, we may be not quite as bad, but there's certainly something that we have to address. So smart companies have really been using lockdown to enhance their technology. Accor Hotels is one. They used lockdown to implement a new property management and reservation systems in 3,000 of their European hotels in a joint venture together with Sabre. This enabled them dozens of PMSs that were sitting in their properties. And the result of this is they will operationally be more efficient. They will be more efficient as far as their data collection is concerned and their speed to market. But this doesn't only need to affect large companies, it also affects small companies. I work with a really nice business called Optimand, who bring OTA-style tools to the independent hotelier. What it does is it uses the tools to give the hotelier advanced data analytics and channel marketing capabilities. And this enables them to get more direct bookings at greater conversions and save a lot of money on OTA commissions, which is great for the small hotelier. I also think that COVID is going to massively change the way that consumers use mobile. Currently, let's look at offline activities such as booking restaurants and museums as an example. In 2016, a survey was run on booking restaurants that found that 91% of people either book restaurants over the phone or in person, and only 9% booked on mobile. I would argue that with the necessity of restaurants now to collect customer data for possible track and tracing, plus museums who need advanced bookings to control flows and mandatory time-controlled bookings, the consumer can no longer just rock up. So this is going to incredibly drive the increase in mobile bookings. And of course, the risk is if you're a business that can't interface or can't use these systems, then that will be a risk for you. So the entrepreneur's dilemma is very often that the risk of adopting technology is high, but specialist knowledge is low. Look, there are certain solutions, and one of those we're looking at is interoperability. Think of it a little bit like the gas and the electricity industry, that if you flick a switch, you can flick between suppliers. And I think, you know, if we can reach that stage, we'll drive a competitive marketplace where IT costs will be lower and flexibility will be much better. You know, and if we can get systems which are talking to each other, this will drive the interconnectivity between businesses, which can only be a good thing for the system. And as Jan alluded to at the beginning, we have a talk at 6:15 European time on Thursday called Tech We know we need it. Now let's remove the roadblocks. And that's with the Open Travel Alliance, ETOA, and IBM. So if you're able to tune into that, that would be great. Another area is what we're doing with the Startup Mentoring Boards. And I'm going to bring in my colleague Ashish now. The Startup Mentoring Board was set up by like-minded people to encourage young entrepreneurs and give back to young entrepreneurs on our time, free of charge, to help with the new generation coming up and drive innovation within the industry. So I'm going to bring in Ashish as of now. Ashish Kumar is a thought leader and a change agent in the area. He is co-chair of FICCI, which is India's largest trade body. He has a career of 40 years spanning leadership roles, and in the last 10 years, this has been involved in business and technology transformation. He runs a bi-weekly show called Coffee with Ashish, where he showcases conversations with CEOs around the industry. He really is an authority both on India and on APAC in general. So we believe that he will bring a great perspective from these important and growing markets. So welcome, Ashish.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Jan, for having me here today. Yes, indeed, it's been truly what you call a black swan moment. We've read about black swans, etc. And of course, now we've got to see one. But like you said, and like the title says, that there will be a silver lining. We'll talk more about it as we go further. But yes, you put it pretty articulately, the times of today, what they are.
Great. So I'm going to give the audience a rest from my voice at the moment and take a glass of water. And I'm going to put a question to you to start with it, Ashish. You've heard what I've been saying about technology in the tourism industry. We'll actually start with technology and then work backwards. With all of your experience, where are you seeing technology right now? And where do you see the Startup Mentoring Board as being able to foster that?
Well, Patrick, when you mentioned about UK, doing the fishing and importing the maximum, the fish that they eat, somehow I relate myself to technology in India. Because today, India has produced some of the largest technology giants globally. But if you look at the travel and tourism perspective, none of them serve the local domestic market. They will compete with the IBMs of the world overseas, but today they invested into the travel technology space. And there are obviously reasons for it. But before I get into the reasons, one need to understand the total dimensions of travel and tourism, where it stands in India. India is a very old country. We all know that in terms of culture and in terms of its. But at the same time, it's a relatively new country since it became independent in 1947. So when it did, travel and tourism has not grown on the back of any policies or structural reforms or well thought out business plans in every field. It has grown on the back of necessity. So suddenly there was a necessity to do something happened. So coming back into technology, the GDS came into the industry in 1993. Predominantly till then, India was a very air-dominated industry. People didn't travel out of the country because the restrictions on foreign exchange and what you were allowed to travel were humongous. And when it opened in 2000, you've seen what it has done to India as an outbound holiday destination. Then you look at the population of India, the demographics of India. I think it's probably the only country in the world which I can, with authority, say, can survive only on its own internal consumptions of domestic tourism, provided it's handled in the manner it should, and I'll come back to technology to answer that. So there's a huge capacity, huge pipeline, huge demand as far as within India travel itself is concerned, be it for corporate travel or be it for holidays or be it for events or be it for anything. Weddings even, because India do like to have lavish weddings. If you look at incoming, it's a market which has always been underserved to the capacity of the country. And perhaps the reasons being that it has been a long haul market. So people from the Western world, be it the US or be it the UK, it's a long haul destination to come to India. And as far as the neighbor countries are concerned, the cultural fit with India hasn't been so great for them, except for the Buddhist traffic and the culturally inclined traffic which has come. Things are changing. So this is where technology is coming in. So in 1993, when GDS came in with open arms to funnel the air industry. They said, here's the GDS, it's free of charge, you don't have to pay anything for it, and in fact, you'll get paid for using it. So the distribution chain across the country started believing that technology was for free. You didn't have to pay for it. And that's the kind of mindset the Indian travel industry grew upon. Till in 2002, a company known as Make My Trip suddenly decided to use the internet space. And that's where the powering of B2C, as we call it, started happening. And even when they started, let me tell you, there were a lot of sniggers around to say, oh, India's got a very poor penetration on the bandwidth. India has no computers, and it won't happen. But what's happened, you've seen what's happened. But we'll come back to what's happened. So things started happening. First of all, on the outbound holiday space, the foreign exchange laws got liberalized. More Indians wanted to travel. There was more money in the economy. The money was reaching smaller cities. Earlier, the travel was in the big 3 or 4 cities. Then they started traveling to the smaller cities outbound. Similarly, within the country, because of the internet penetration, B2C coming into the play over the next 10 years or so. But predominantly, people still started thinking that it is something you didn't have to pay for, because suddenly B2B players came in with their own technology offering and say, look, I've got the ticket coming out of it. I've got holidays. I'll give you the system free. Please take it. So that's the kind of mindset the Indian industry has always stood on. And I'm not going into suppliers like hotels, etc., because even the hotels, they thought technology meant once the guests walked into the hotel. They didn't have to do great things in terms of generating demand or creating supply chains to reach out. That was all done by the online travel industry. They created the interfaces between the hotel and the consumer, so to say. There was hardly little investment coming from the hotel. The airline was still better off because there were GDSs and Navitairs and other kind of LCC platforms, which was funding that kind of situation. So in this thing, with the country, which could just enough take care of the internal outbound, and this thing suddenly exploded. Then comes the mobile technology. Again, there was cynicism as far as India is concerned, that, who can afford even a mobile call, let alone owning the instrument. And before you realize it, today India has the longest talk time anywhere in the world. We Indians love to talk on the phone, if you take it in terms of billing per individual. And suddenly, the mobile smartphone, it's reaching the smallest town in the country. So therefore, the point here I'm trying to make is that not that there has been a blueprint of like-minded travel people and professionals who have got up together to say, okay, let's draw up a blueprint, but it has just happened. Now, what has COVID done? COVID has brought everything down to ground zero. It has neutralized everything. The hotels have been neutralized, the airlines have been neutralized, the tour operators, and so on and so forth, all the intermediary. Suddenly, there is a wake-up call which says, hey, we need to do something about this. We need to see. And the other point in India was, I think the travel industry was working to create jobs. Yeah, the manpower wasn't so expensive as the rest of the world, including many countries in the APEC world. So, rather than spending some money on technology, let me load 2 more people at the front end. They'll take care of the booking. So why do I need technology for it? So with that kind of mindset, COVID has flattened everything. They realize people's salaries are costs to be paid. Real estate, to put these people in the offices, is a cost to be paid. So if there could be something which could be done to make technology take away all that, that's something which has to happen. So I think there is going to be, in my mind, and I talked to you today, that within 2 years, there will be a revolution of IT as far as India is concerned. India will look totally different than what you see today. That's my own prophecy as I sit here on business models, as we've been operating, because the simple reason people have now realized that there is no option. You can't keep loading human being and real estate and do everything manually in the game. So technology per nature has to come. Lastly, again, as far as technology, there is technology and there's technology. You talked about the back office technology, you talked about the mid office technology, you talked about the user interface technology. Therefore, all pipeline end to end is being scrutinized as I speak by everyone. The question is how soon and how can the universe get together to have the systems talk to each other, just as you suggested in your discourse earlier. And I think that's where we are coming from, Patrick. But one thing is for sure, that India has enough of its own domestic demand to take care of for the next few years, if only they were to get their act together. And technology is one of them. I'll just give you one more example as I speak. Try this. There are 23 million rail seats on sale every day in India. Wow. Railway, 23 million. That's pre-COVID. Now, of course, the trains aren't going. Out of 23 million, only 10% of them are automated. In other words, you can book online. Rest of the 90%, you can't book online. You got to line up in a queue on the railway station to be able to buy it, or you have to get some middleman to go and stand for you to be able to do it. So look at the humongous opportunity if you were to digitalize all this into one platform. Attach your hotels into the pipeline. And before you realize, you have a huge pipeline of growth.
You know, I was so interested, Ashish, to take that point on staffing in India. Lemon Tree Hotels, by his own admission, I'm sure you know the CEO.
Yeah.
By his own admission, he said, "Look, when COVID came along, we looked at our staff, and without making any technology improvements at all, simply by saying we have so many engineering department people in this hotel and so many in that hotel, and making some equalization, he was able to reduce his labor costs by 30%. Yes. That's before he made investments in technology. And, you know, although I think that India is probably an extreme case of that, from exactly the reasons that you're putting forward, to an extent, some of that same those same savings in labor and that investment into technology need to be made in the West as well.
Yeah, and you know, coming back to you referred about that 30% syndrome on the technology. I mean, it resonates well, but if you elaborate a bit more on that, I'll be able to add some more inputs from my own experiences as to what we see in India, because that's been one of the biggest backbreakers, so to say.
Yeah, look, even at a non-travel level, you know, I have in my network people who act as consultants for, you know, some of the biggest blue chips. By universal agreement, those guys only use their technology to 20 to 30% of its capacity. That's just not going to be tenable anymore. And I think in travel, and because, as you say, so much of this happens in a reaction to a market that was growing from 170 million travelers in 1970 to 1.4 billion in 2019. So much of this was reactive that we can't afford to react anymore. And that press the reset button is going to be really important.
Yeah. You know, the point I add here in India, and that's culturally speaking, because of the manpower I just spoke about earlier. I think traditionally travel agents want to want to make it known to their customers that their bookings cannot be serviced without them being present. So that's a culture, because it's a self-importance they want to live in. And what technology started doing, it started bringing transparency to many things, be it inventory, be it pricing, be it whatever, to customers. And human beings don't want to be transparent by nature when they're doing commercial transactions. I mean, that's what we noticed here. So the reason for this 30% syndrome resonates in India, not only because entrepreneurs or board level people have not been able to understand what the functional specification should be translated into a development perspective, but the users themselves make sure that they don't function well, because then it will bring a certain amount of transparency to their processes, and therefore their jobs may get eliminated, or at least their transparency on the pricing. So, you know, it's a vicious circle. That, I take it, the COVID will push the board level people and the entrepreneurs to say, you know, I don't care, it just has to work. So I've always believed that the CEO has to say, I don't care how it is, it has to be implemented, it has to be implemented, now just go do it. And that will has been missing in many of the technology solutions.
But how do you, let me ask you this question, Ashish. You know, there are so many incredibly intelligent young people who have such a great grasp of technology. But, you know, old dogs like you and I also know and understand certain business wisdom from experience of crises that have happened in the past, be that in from 9/11 or back to the Gulf War in 1990, and, you know, financial crashes and all of these things that we've lived through and developed business through those. How, in your view, do you fuse that knowledge and experience that we've learned through our professional careers with all of the exciting young talent that's coming up?
You know, when you were saying that there got to be collaboration, there got to be synergies between various people, I think the biggest collaboration you will have globally today is knowledge. Knowledge is the biggest collaborator you would have. And old dogs like us, therefore, should be able to impart that knowledge into the young mindset, to be able to put their dreams, put their thoughts, put their skills into a broader perspective, which they otherwise struggle in the existing ecosystem of the travel universe to be able to find a place. Because for them to build a scale out of current crisis will take many years till they collaborate with existing people. And I think that's where our skills and knowledge, etc., should come into play, to be able to find them the right partners and the right fit to be able to work together.
You know, my brother has a great saying. He's involved in biotechnology,
right,
and his business is to take small, interesting bits of chemistry and really grow it and then take it to market and getting funding, etc., etc. And he always says, you know, as I'm developing these businesses, I have to cut out so much interesting chemistry, because you have to be focused, and you really have to focus on the main technological solution that you're going to be providing. But he says, you know, once I've taken that business afloat, I then go back to the cutting room floor and take up some of those interesting bits of chemistry that we've edited out.
Right.
That forms the basis for our new business. And I think that also goes on within the travel industry. And we see some interesting technologies that are coming up that are not solving new problems. Some of them are solving old problems that we spotted back in the 1990s and the 1980s, and those perennial things that are going on. Actually, there's a really good story I would love to share, which is not my story. It's actually a story from the guy who set up Viator, who's an Australian guy called Rod Cuthbert. And they were commissioned, they won the contract from Sabre to set up this business that started to put tours and sightseeings, day tours and sightseeings online. And for about 3-4 years, they worked with various executives in Sabre, who of course loved to come down to Australia, and they went to Bondi Beach and they'd show them a great time or whatever. After 9/11, Sabre went through one of its periodic culls where it got rid of so many of its staff. And this is where I hark back to this, the opportunities to be gained from some trimming. And all of the guys who were on Rod's project team were culled from Sabre. And suddenly he had no contacts whatsoever, nobody to speak to. So he called around and finally got through to some senior vice president who said, you know, yeah, you've got through to the right guy. You know, I'm in charge of this area, but you know what? This doesn't even sit on the top 10 of our interest list. So, you know what? We're not interested. And Rod said, but you know, we spent the last 4 years working with you. You can't break this contract. And the guy said, you know what? You can have the technology. Just take it. We'll give you all the intellectual property rights. 10 years later, Rod and his partners sold Viator for $200 million based on that technology, which is a great story as to, one, the luck that you can get in business, but two, how the offcuttings from existing businesses can become really important businesses in their own right.
And you mentioned about travel being the preserve of rich. Let me again add a little story as far as India is concerned, and then you can clarify on that. To the policymakers, to people in power in India, the ministers, travel has always been perceived as a luxury item. It's, you know, only rich people travel. And that's anyway changing now. Till there was one man, he was captain in the army, his name was Gopinath, who set up an airline known as Air Deccan, which obviously got sold later on to Kingfisher. And he just made one statement. He says, every man can fly. And he started the first low-cost carrier in India. And that's where the whole cost and the equation of airline travel also changed in India. And today the government themselves have bid out for almost 150 airstrips and airport in India, which have not been used for some reason or the other. Either they belong to the defenses or they're used for non-commercial purposes, to develop them into the airport. So you can imagine the amount of connectivity it would provide even within this country as far as air is concerned. But yes, talking about being preserved of the rich, it's gone beyond that point as far as India is concerned, because travel has reached everywhere. And
yeah, but you don't want that. You don't want that to stop again. You know, we've seen airfares that are $60 or $70 or whatever. You know, if these airfares suddenly go up to $500, that will cut off a certain a certain income bracket from traveling, and that's not a great thing. Look, I you know, you and I both remember India when the outbound market exploded in around 99, you know, when the currency restrictions were lifted.
Yeah.
Most Indian tourism came to London or came to Europe in coach tours, 7 days, 5 countries, etc., etc. This isn't the case any longer. You know, you'll have Indians who will be, you know, hiking in Patagonia or whiskey drinking in Scotland and doing all of those experiential pieces of travel. But, you know, you have to start somewhere and you can't cut off the first-time traveler. The first-time traveler in 1998 is now the guy who, after coming to traveling the world for the last 20 years, is now going whiskey drinking in Scotland or hiking in Patagonia or climbing mountains in Australia. You know, there's a food chain here where people grow up through the ecosystem and become more sophisticated. And somehow, with price potentially cutting things off at the bottom, that could be a very bad consequence, in my view, for the tourism business, and we shouldn't let it happen.
Yeah, you know, it's my own belief as far as Indian market is concerned. The bottom of the pyramid, right, will move up, which effectively means that people who have only traveled for maybe some religious purpose. Religion, of course, and faith is a big movement of people. It's one of the biggest hardships you can ever do is actually go on a religious tour, because it's a totally unorganized sector. 63% of Indians travel for the purpose of some faith or the other, right? So I believe that the low cost bottom of the pyramid will start moving up. the day that starts moving up, it may not take 2 trips a year, it may take 1 trip a year. You will be adding more and more people once the economy improves over the next 2-3 years. So you will have a much larger base of travelers than you have today. As far as the people who are already on top of the pyramid and they used to take 3 trips a year, yes, I agree with you. Probably they may take 1 every 2 years. But I think you're looking at a long haul situation. If you can ride over the next 2-3 years, I think it will be a more sustainable future. But it's important to ride over the next 2-3 years. And I don't think the airlines, I know they need to survive. I know the hotels need to survive. Everybody needs to survive. Cash flows, you mentioned already, cash is the king. The prices will go up in the short term. But I think somewhere people will have to remind that the price is directly related. Demand can only be fostered with the price equation. So somewhere will have to find money to be pumped in to keep that demand and pricing equality going. It will happen, Patrick. I'm a great believer in that.
Jan, do we have time for one more subject?
How much time do you need, Patrick?
I'm sorry?
How much time would you need?
Oh, 3 minutes.
3 minutes we got.
3 minutes, okay. So let me put one more question to you. I referenced what I called the unstoppable drive towards sustainability in tourism. How are you seeing this playing out in India?
Well, I think, like I said, the COVID will probably, it has flattened everything. And when it has flattened things, it's like, you know, if you had a heritage home, what do you do to it? If you want to renovate it, you say, okay, let me patch up this wall, let me do this, but you won't bring any structural changes to it because you wouldn't want to demolish that building. But when that building gets demolished, you have no other choice but to build it with a new foundation up. So I think as far as the Indian travel scenario and the worldwide, of course, but more so India, because like I said, India hasn't gone on the back of any great blueprint or planning. I think people will start now rebuilding themselves into a more sustainable future, a more progressive outlook, because they realize they don't want to be staring at another COVID 5 years from now, whenever the next one is going to be due, if at all. So I think they will look at obviously drawing something which is future-proof, more sustainable. There's already been a lot of talks. I'll just quickly say, close on the eco-tourism part of the view. India has suffered, like many other countries, with plastic bottles and things being thrown on the beaches, on the hillside, and the trash being all over, the sense of hygiene. I'm glad the government of India is playing a great role in a scheme they have, which they call Swachh Bharat, which stands for Clean India, where there is a campaign, of course, to clean your neighboring and surrounding. And I think COVID is again playing that role because you have no choice but to be more hygienic in your movement. So I think you will have a model which is more sustainable. That's fine.
I think it's a massive task wherever we go. In Europe, we have, or we certainly had, 146,000 hotels. Now, I think only 18,000 of them are major chains. So there's a long tail of small properties, you know, and most of them have not adopted any kind of sustainable practice. So, you know, I agree. It's going to be a long haul to work with what is a huge SME infrastructure to be able to drive some of these initiatives.
Yeah, painful times, Patrick. But I think out of the pain will appear better tomorrow. You know, and like old dogs. I think if guys like us can be optimistic, I'm sure the youth of the country and the world will be more optimistic.
Well, they're the 3 silver linings that I see. You know, better collaboration, better drive towards sustainability, and a renewed appetite to be able to adopt technology so we can do more with less. You know, just remains me to thank Jan for giving us the opportunity and really to thank you, Ashish, for a really interesting conversation. Thanks so much to the both of you, and thanks so much to the listeners. If anybody wants any more information about any of the things that we've talked about, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Patrick.
Patrick, you asked if you could have 3 more minutes. I could have listened to this for 60 minutes still. Very entertaining. I quote 2 old dogs, entertaining wisdom. It was really great. Thank you so much. Let me, one final remark. You said at the beginning, you mentioned Warren Buffett, and you said about financial sound businesses, and you gave the example, the airlines only have cash for 2 months. I would want to do one day a session on economics. I think we have huge economic challenges, not only in the travel industry, but globally in the industry at all. Another fund manager, not Warren Buffett, but Dalio, said 6 months ago, the capitalistic system is broken. That is perhaps a bit too much, but there are a lot of cracks which need to be repaired, and they come very apparent when we see the financial, economic challenges we are facing today. So with these words, thank you, 2 old dogs, very entertaining, a lot of wisdom. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jan. Thanks, Ashish.
Thanks, Patrick. Take care. Bye.